China just solved a problem nobody admitted existed. Not the chip shortage, not the housing crisis, not the water table, something quieter and considerably more devastating than any of those. A loneliness epidemic so severe that the government classified it a national public health emergency and then did what China does when it decides a problem is serious enough to warrant a real response. It funded robots, not factory robots, not warehouse robots, robots designed to sit across from a human being, look them in the eye, remember their daughter's birthday, and make them feel for the first time in months like somebody actually cares. The loneliness crisis. Nobody wanted to name China has a loneliness problem nobody discusses. Not in polite conversation, not in government press releases, not in the kind of international coverage that tends to focus on GDP figures and export data and military posturing. But the numbers are sitting there, patient and damning, waiting for someone to finally add them up. A 2023 survey conducted across major Chinese cities found that nearly 30% of adults over 60 reported feeling lonely on most days. A separate study from Peking University put the figure for adults living alone at something closer to 40%, experiencing what researchers classified as chronic social isolation. These are not rounding errors or statistical noise. These are tens of millions of people sitting in apartments in villages, in rooms full of furniture and empty of conversation, waiting for a phone that rings less and less often. The scale of China's aging population transforms this from a social welfare concern into something closer to a civilizational emergency. China has more people over 60 than the entire population of the United States. Let that land for a moment. Every single American, from a newborn in a hospital in Montana to a retiree on a porch in Florida, that entire nation's worth of people fits inside China's elderly population count with room to spare. By 2050, that number is projected to exceed 500 million, roughly 1 in 3 Chinese citizens classified as elderly. The infrastructure required to care for that many aging adults through conventional means, through human caregivers, through family support networks, through institutional facilities, does not exist and cannot be built fast enough through traditional approaches alone. The math simply does not work. The caregiving workforce required would need to be larger than the current population of several mid sized European nations combined, all recruited, trained, and deployed within the next 2 decades. Loneliness, it turns out, is not merely an emotional condition, it is a medical one with a body count. Research published across multiple peer reviewed journals in the last decade has linked chronic loneliness to a 45% increased risk of early death, a 50% increased risk of developing dementia, and cardiovascular outcomes comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Nobody would tolerate a public health crisis that handed 60 million people a smoking habit they never consented to. But loneliness at that scale has been largely invisible to the systems designed to detect public health threats because it doesn't show up on an x ray. It doesn't fill emergency rooms in ways that generate newspaper coverage, and it doesn't produce the kind of dramatic imagery that forces policy action. China decided to stop waiting for dramatic imagery. The government began formally identifying social isolation among elderly citizens as a measurable public health metric around 2021, incorporating it into community level health assessments in pilot cities across Zhejiang, Guangdong, and Sichuan provinces. The conclusion those assessments reached was uncomfortable and entirely unsurprising to anyone who had been paying close attention. The problem was enormous. It was accelerating year over year, and the conventional policy toolkit had nothing inside it big enough to address it at the required scale. That conclusion cleared the way for what came next, and what came next was unlike anything the elder care world had seen before. The 421 problem that started everything. China's demographic structure created this crisis systematically, not through malice or negligence, but through mathematics, through the compounding arithmetic of the one child policy enforced from 1980 to 2015, a policy that reshaped the country's population pyramid into a configuration no society had ever attempted to manage before, and no policy playbook had ever been written to address. The result has a name that demographers use with the grim efficiency of people who have stared at too many population graphs for too many consecutive years. They call it the 421 problem: four grandparents, two parents, one child, one working age adult responsible in both cultural expectation and explicit legal obligation under Chinese elder care law for the financial and emotional support of six aging relatives simultaneously. That structure is not sustainable at the individual level, and it becomes genuinely catastrophic when you aggregate it across a nation of 1.4 billion people. The single child at the bottom of that demographic pyramid is also trying to hold a job, service a mortgage in one of the world's most expensive housing markets, potentially raise children of their own, and navigate a labor market that increasingly demands 60-hour work weeks as the basic price of participation. The arithmetic leaves almost no hours in the week for the kind of sustained, present, emotionally attentive caregiving that elderly isolation actually requires. You cannot schedule away loneliness. It does not respond to a monthly visit and a phone call on Sundays. It requires consistent, daily, reliable human contact, and that is precisely what the 421 structure has made structurally impossible for millions of Chinese families who desperately want to provide it. This is not a failure of love or of cultural values. It is a failure of arithmetic, and the distinction matters enormously for understanding what comes next. Adult children in China are not abandoning their parents because they stopped caring or because filial piety dissolved overnight. They are failing to be present because the geometry of modern Chinese economic life has stretched the distance between care and the people who need it to a point where daily presence becomes genuinely physically impossible. A factory worker in Shenzhen, whose parents live in rural Sichuan, cannot provide daily emotional contact regardless of how fiercely they want to. The robot, when it arrives at that parent's door, is not replacing that person's love. It is filling the hours that love cannot physically reach across that distance. The government understood this framing early and built the entire policy and funding apparatus around it rather than around a more technocratic efficiency argument. This was not positioned publicly as technology replacing human connection, which would have been both politically toxic and factually dishonest. It was positioned as technology extending human connection, bridging the gap between the care people wanted to provide and the care that geography, economics, and simple arithmetic actually allowed them to deliver. That framing turned out to be critically important because it determined not just how the robots were funded and deployed, but how they were designed at a fundamental level, what they were built to do, and equally importantly, what they were built to feel like. What these robots actually are. These are not the robots you are picturing. Not the cold, angular, vaguely threatening humanoid machines that populated science fiction for most of the 20th century and still dominate the mental image most people reach for when someone says the word robot. What China's companion robotics companies have been developing and, in an increasing number of cases, deploying in real elder care settings across the country looks and behaves substantially differently from anything that came before it in the category. The design philosophy started with a question that sounds simple and turned out to be extraordinarily hard to answer in engineering terms. What does a robot need to be for an elderly person to actually want to spend time with it? The answer that emerged from user research conducted across multiple Chinese cities was not what the engineers initially expected. Elderly users did not primarily want a robot that could perform physical tasks, though that mattered. They did not primarily want a robot that could answer questions accurately, though that also mattered. What they wanted, expressed in different language across hundreds of interviews and observation sessions, was a robot that remembered them, that knew their name without being told again, that recalled the conversation from 3 days ago and asked a follow-up question, that noticed when they seemed quieter than usual and responded to that observation with something other than a pre-programmed wellness check script. They wanted, in short, something that behaved like it was paying attention, like they were worth paying attention to. That insight drove the entire design architecture of what emerged. The robots are typically humanoid in general form, a head, a face capable of expression, arms, a body designed to occupy space at approximately human scale. But the surfaces are soft, the proportions are slightly rounded rather than angular, and the faces are designed to read as warm rather than precise. The voice synthesis systems prioritize naturalness over accuracy, deliberately introducing the slight variations and hesitations of genuine speech rather than the uncanny smoothness of early text-to-speech systems. Every design decision traces back to the same principle. The robot must feel like a presence, not a product. The companies building the future. Several companies are driving this space hard. Fourier Intelligence, based in Shanghai, has built what it calls a general-purpose humanoid designed specifically for care environments. Their GR series robots are built around a high degree of freedom actuator system that allows fluid, human-like movement without the mechanical jerkiness that makes earlier robots deeply uncomfortable to watch for extended periods. Fourier has partnered directly with rehabilitation hospitals and elder care facilities across China, using real deployment data to iterate the system in ways that no laboratory environment could replicate. They are not building toward care robots. They are already operating them, learning from every interaction and updating accordingly. Unitree Robotics, out of Hangzhou, came up through the quadruped robot space. Their dog-like robots became briefly famous in videos that circulated widely internationally, but has since moved aggressively into bipedal humanoid development. Their H-series robots are notable for a power-to-weight ratio that outperforms most Western equivalents at comparable price points, a reflection of the vertical integration advantages that Chinese hardware companies have spent a decade quietly building. Unitree is not primarily a care robot company by positioning, but the underlying platform capabilities they are developing feed directly into the companion robotics space in ways that make them impossible to ignore in any serious analysis of where this field is going. Xiaomi entered the humanoid space with Cyber One, unveiled in 2022, and has continued developing the platform with the kind of sustained investment that only a company with Xiaomi's hardware manufacturing depth can sustain. Uptech, headquartered in Shenzhen, has been developing its Walker series robots for years and has moved its Walker S into actual enterprise deployment in manufacturing and service environments, experience that generates the kind of real-world operational data that pure research programs simply cannot replicate. And Leju Robotics, a smaller and less internationally recognized player, has been specifically targeting the elder care segment with a platform called Quavo, designed from the ground up around the companion use case, rather than adapted from an industrial or research starting point. What makes the Chinese feel distinctive is not that any single one of these companies has definitively solved companion robotics. None of them has. What is distinctive is the density of serious, well-funded, technically sophisticated attempts, all happening simultaneously, all operating in a domestic market large enough to absorb early-stage deployment at meaningful scale, and all feeding learnings back into a shared national innovation ecosystem that the government has deliberately structured to accelerate cross-pollination between players. The engineering stack behind the emotion. Making a robot feel present is an engineering problem, not a philosophy problem, not a psychology problem. At the implementation level, it is an engineering problem of extraordinary complexity, and the solutions China's robotics companies are converging on reveal how far the underlying technology has matured in a very short period. The physical layer starts with actuation, moving a robot limb smoothly with the kind of fluid deceleration and microadjustment that human movement produces unconsciously, requires actuators that can modulate force output with extremely fine granularity across the full range of motion. Early humanoid robots moved in ways that registered immediately as wrong to human observers, triggering what researchers call the uncanny valley response, that specific discomfort of something that is almost but not quite human. The actuator technology now coming out of Chinese robotics manufacturers has largely closed that gap for slow to moderate speed movements, which is precisely the movement profile that matters in a care context. The sensory layer is where the emotional intelligence of these systems actually originates. Modern companion robots carry arrays of cameras, microphones, depth sensors, and in some implementations, millimeter wave radar that allows the system to detect breathing rate and heart rate variability without physical contact. These sensor arrays feed into machine learning models trained on enormous data sets of human interaction, allowing the robot to classify emotional states, detect discomfort, recognize familiar faces, and recall associated conversational history, and adjust its own behavioral output in response to what it is observing in real time. The system is not understanding emotion in the way a human does, but it is responding to the signals emotion produces in ways that a human observing the interaction from the outside would find difficult to distinguish from genuine understanding. The memory layer is what the user research identified as most critical, and it is where the large language model integration becomes decisive. Current companion robot platforms from leading Chinese developers use locally run or hybrid LLM systems that maintain persistent conversational memory across sessions. The system remembers that this particular user mentioned a granddaughter named May last Thursday, and can refer back to that naturally in today's conversation without being prompted. That capability, which sounds modest described in a sentence, produces a profound emotional response in users who have spent months or years feeling that nobody around them was paying close enough attention to remember. What Japan tried and China learned. Japan got here first. Japan's demographics ran ahead of China's by roughly a generation, and the Japanese robotics industry responded to its own elder care crisis with a wave of companion and care robot development that began seriously in the early 2000s. Paro, the therapeutic robot seal developed by Japan's National Institute of Advanced Industrial Science and Technology, has been deployed in elder care facilities across Japan and Europe since the mid 2000s. Pepper, the humanoid robot from SoftBank Robotics, was deployed in thousands of retail, hospitality, and care contexts across Japan starting around 2015. The Japanese effort was genuine, serious, and produced real learning. It also produced real limitations that China's developers have studied carefully. Paro worked for a specific and narrow use case, passive comfort for dementia patients who responded to its animal-like form but could not scale to general companion functionality. Pepper generated enormous initial enthusiasm and then ran into a persistent problem. After the novelty wore off, sustained engagement dropped sharply. Users interacted with Pepper as a curiosity, not as a companion. The conversational capability was not deep enough, the memory was not persistent enough, and the emotional responsiveness was not nuanced enough to survive extended daily contact with a user who needed more than novelty. China's developers inherited those findings and built around the failure modes Japan identified. Deeper LLM integration for conversational persistence, richer sensor arrays for emotional state detection, softer physical design to reduce the novelty-seeking framing and encourage habitual interaction. The work Japan did was not wasted. It was a very expensive and very useful proof of concept for what the category needed to become. The controversy nobody can agree on. Not everyone thinks this is a good idea. The opposition to companion robotics comes from multiple directions simultaneously, and the arguments deserve to be taken seriously rather than dismissed as technophobia or sentimentality. The most fundamental objection is a substitution argument. When you provide someone with a robotic companion that satisfies enough of their social needs to reduce their distress, you also reduce the pressure on families, communities, and governments to provide the actual human connection that person deserves. The robot becomes not a bridge to human care, but a substitute for it. The loneliness gets managed rather than solved, and the structural conditions that created it go unaddressed because the immediate suffering has been sufficiently muted. This is not a hypothetical concern. It is the documented experience of multiple pilot programs in both Japan and early Chinese deployments, where family visit frequency declined measurably after a companion robot was introduced into an elderly relative's home. The robot made the situation feel less urgent. The robot made it easier not to visit, and nobody involved consciously intended that outcome, which is precisely what makes it difficult to design around. The second major objection concerns dignity. There is something in the companion robot proposition that sits uncomfortably with certain foundational ideas about what elderly people are owed by the societies that produced them. A person who spent 60 years working, raising children, paying taxes, and contributing to their community deserves genuine human presence in their final years, not a machine designed to simulate it convincingly enough that they stop noticing the difference. The counter argument that a robot companion providing daily warm interaction is meaningfully better than no interaction at all is also true. Both things are true simultaneously, and the tension between them does not resolve cleanly. The data question that changes everything. Here is the part of this story that gets discussed least and matters most. Every conversation a companion robot has with an elderly user is data. Every expressed fear, every mentioned health symptom, every revealed family conflict, every moment of confusion or cognitive decline captured by the robot's sensor array, all of it is logged, processed, and stored by systems whose data governance terms most users will never read and could not meaningfully evaluate if they tried. The companion robot is not just a care device, it is the most intimate data collection instrument ever deployed at consumer scale, sitting inside someone's home, running 24 hours a day with the explicit trust of a person who may not fully understand what they have invited in. China's data regulatory environment around this category remains genuinely underdeveloped relative to the sensitivity of what is being collected. The Personal Information Protection Law passed in 2021 establishes baseline principles, but the specific frameworks governing continuous biometric and behavioral data collection by care robots have not been finalized at a level of specificity that provides meaningful protection. The companies developing these systems are not villains operating in bad faith, but the commercial incentives around health data are powerful enough that the absence of strong regulatory constraint represents a structural risk that grows with every unit deployed. This is not a reason to stop the development. It is a reason to build the regulatory architecture urgently and seriously before the deployment scale makes governance retroactively impossible. China's export play. Nobody is discussing the domestic market is just the beginning. China's companion robotics companies are not building for 60 million lonely elderly Chinese citizens and then stopping. They are building at domestic scale, learning at domestic scale, reducing costs at domestic scale, and then preparing to sell the resulting platforms to every other society on Earth that is facing the same demographic mathematics China is currently navigating, which turns out to be almost all of them. South Korea has a faster aging population than China by most demographic metrics. Japan's elder care deficit is structural and severe and already documented in detail. Germany, Italy, Spain, and virtually every other major Western European economy faces a caregiving workforce shortage that its domestic robotics industry is nowhere near equipped to address at the required scale. The United States has 57 million adults over 65 today and will have nearly 80 million by 2040. Every single one of those markets represents a potential customer for a well designed, cost competitive, culturally adaptable companion robot platform built on the manufacturing and AI infrastructure that China is constructing right now. The price point that Chinese manufacturers are targeting for mature companion robot platforms, somewhere in the range of $15,000 to $25,000 per unit at scale, is substantially below what Western competitors would need to charge to cover their own development and manufacturing costs. That price differential, combined with the years of real world deployment data that Chinese companies will have accumulated before most Western competitors have completed their first serious prototype, creates a competitive position in the global care robotics market that looks uncomfortably familiar to anyone who watched what happened in solar panels, electric vehicles, and consumer electronics. China builds for its own enormous domestic market first. Then the domestic market becomes a platform. Then the platform becomes a global industry. The West tends to notice this pattern around step 3, which is historically about one step too late. China built robots to fix loneliness. That sentence sounds like science fiction and reads like a headline designed to generate clicks, and the temptation is to file it in the same mental folder as every other grand technological promise that eventually collapsed under the weight of real-world complexity. Resist that temptation. The engineering is real. The deployments are real. The demographic pressure driving the investment is not going away and is not getting smaller. The companies building these systems are serious, well-funded, and operating in a domestic market large enough to generate the kind of iterative real-world learning that no laboratory program can replicate. And the problem they are trying to solve, tens of millions of elderly people experiencing a form of suffering that is measurable, consequential, and largely invisible to the systems designed to address public health, is as real and as urgent as any problem technology has ever been pointed at. Whether companion robots ultimately prove to be a genuine solution or an elaborate and expensive way of managing a crisis without confronting its root causes is a question that will take another decade of deployment and honest evaluation to answer. What is not a question is whether China is serious about finding out. They are building the answer right now, one robot at a time, in a country with more elderly people than most continents, and a government that has decided with characteristic directness that waiting for a better option is no longer a viable strategy.